The morning of June 15th began like any other at Gackham Park, Princess Anne's beloved country estate. The early summer air carried the sweet scent of blooming roses and freshly cut grass as the Princess Royal prepared for what would become one of the most challenging days of her life. At 68 years old, Anne had weathered countless storms, both personal and public, but nothing could have prepared her for the events that would unfold in the coming hours. Princess Anne had always been the steady anchor of the royal family, the one who never complained, never faltered, and never showed the world anything less than complete composure. Her reputation as the hardest-working member of the royal family was well-earned, with over 500 engagements annually and a work ethic that put people half her age to shame. But, on this particular morning, as she walked through the palace gardens preparing for a charity event, something was terribly wrong. The first signs were subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who didn't know Anne intimately. Her usually brisk pace had slowed slightly, and she paused more frequently than usual to examine the carefully tended flower beds. Her lady-in-waiting, Sarah Jenkins, had served the princess for over 15 years and noticed these small changes immediately. Sarah had learned to read Anne's moods and physical state like a well-loved book, and what she saw concerned her deeply. Anne had been pushing herself harder than usual in recent weeks. The royal family was dealing with multiple crises simultaneously, and, as always, Anne had stepped up to shoulder more than her fair share of the burden. The ongoing controversies surrounding other family members meant that Anne's steady presence was needed more than ever. She had been traveling extensively, attending events across the country, and working late into the night on correspondence and planning. The charity event scheduled for that afternoon was particularly important to Anne. It was the annual fundraiser for Save the Children, an organization she had supported for over 40 years. The event would bring together donors, volunteers, and beneficiaries from across the United Kingdom, and Anne had spent weeks personally reviewing every detail to ensure its success. The pressure she felt to make everything perfect was immense, not just because of her dedication to the cause, but because she knew the media would be watching for any sign of weakness or failure. As Anne continued her morning walk through the gardens, she felt a strange sensation in her chest. It started as a flutter, almost like nervous excitement, but quickly intensified into something more concerning. Her breathing became slightly labored, though she tried to hide it from Sarah, who was walking a respectful distance behind her. Anne had always prided herself on her physical fitness and had never experienced anything like this before. The palace gardens at this time of year were spectacular, with carefully planned displays that showcased the finest of British horticulture. Anne had always found peace and strength in these gardens, using her morning walks as a time to center herself before facing the demands of her public duties. But, today, the familiar comfort of the gardens felt different, almost oppressive. Sarah noticed that Anne had stopped walking and was standing very still near a large oak tree that had been planted to commemorate her mother's coronation. The symbolism was not lost on either woman. Anne's deep connection to duty and service, inherited from Queen Elizabeth II, had defined her entire life. But, standing beneath that tree, Anne felt the weight of decades of service pressing down on her like never before. The early morning light filtered through the leaves, creating a dappled pattern on the ground around Anne's feet. She found herself focusing intently on these patterns, using them as an anchor as the strange sensations in her body intensified. Her heart was racing now, and she could feel a cold sweat beginning to form despite the warm summer air. Anne tried to take a deep breath to steady herself, but found that her lungs wouldn't quite cooperate. The sensation was frightening, but she was determined not to show any sign of distress. She had learned early in life that royal duty meant maintaining composure regardless of personal discomfort, and she wasn't about to abandon that principle now. Sarah, meanwhile, was growing increasingly worried. She could see that something was wrong with the princess, but she also knew Anne well enough to understand that any direct inquiry about her health would be firmly rebuffed. Instead, Sarah moved slightly closer, positioning herself where she could respond quickly if needed while maintaining the respectful distance that royal protocol required. The gardens around them were coming alive with the sounds of morning activity. Groundskeepers were beginning their daily routines, and, in the distance, the palace staff were preparing for the day ahead. The normalcy of these sounds contrasted sharply with the growing sense of emergency that both Anne and Sarah were feeling. Anne's mind raced as she tried to understand what was happening to her body. She had always been proud of her excellent health and fitness, maintaining an active lifestyle that included regular horseback riding and other physical activities. The idea that her body might be failing her was deeply unsettling, not just because of the physical discomfort, but because of what it might mean for her ability to continue her royal duties. As the minutes passed, Anne's condition continued to deteriorate. The fluttering in her chest had become a pronounced irregular rhythm, and she was finding it increasingly difficult to maintain her balance. The world around her seemed to be taking on a dreamlike quality, with colors appearing more vivid and sounds becoming strangely distant. Sarah could no longer ignore the obvious signs of distress. Despite the risk of overstepping her bounds, she took a step closer to the princess and spoke in a quiet, concerned tone. And looked at her lady-in-waiting with eyes that revealed both vulnerability and determination, a combination that Sarah had never seen before in all her years of service. The moment of crisis was approaching rapidly, but neither woman could have predicted exactly how it would unfold. And, drawing on reserves of strength that had sustained her through decades of public service, made a decision that would surprise everyone who knew her. Instead of calling for immediate help or retreating to the privacy of the palace, she chose to continue with her planned schedule, determined not to let whatever was happening to her interfere with her duties. This decision, born from a lifetime of putting duty before personal comfort, would prove to be both admirable and dangerous. Asin took her first unsteady steps away from the oak tree, heading toward the palace to prepare for the charity event. Neither she nor Sarah could have imagined how dramatically the day would unfold. The morning sun continued to rise, casting longer shadows across the gardens as Asin walked slowly back toward the palace. Each step required tremendous effort, but she was determined to maintain her dignity and composure. The charity event was too important, and too many people were counting on her, for her to let them down now. As they approached the palace's rear entrance, and paused one more time, looking back at the gardens that had been her sanctuary for so many years, something told her that this morning would be significant, that whatever was happening to her would change things in ways she couldn't yet understand. But, with characteristic royal resolve, she pushed these thoughts aside and focused on the tasks ahead. The palace staff bustling about their morning duties had no idea that their beloved Princess Royal was fighting an internal battle that would soon become impossible to hide. Anne's determination to continue with her scheduled activities, despite her body's clear signals of distress, reflected the extraordinary sense of duty that had defined her entire life. Little did anyone know that within hours, this same determination would lead to a moment of vulnerability so profound that it would shock not just the palace staff and the assembled charity guests, but the entire nation. The strong, unflappable princess Anne was about to face the greatest challenge of her life, and how she met the challenge would reveal depths of courage and humanity that would inspire people around the world. As Anne entered the palace, preparing to face whatever lay ahead, the stage was set for an extraordinary day that would test every ounce of her legendary strength and determination. Inside the palace, Anne moved through the familiar corridors with careful deliberation, her years of training helping her maintain an outward appearance of normalcy despite the growing chaos within her body. The grand hallways, lined with portraits of her ancestors, seemed to watch over her with silent understanding. These walls had witnessed generations of royals facing their own private battles while maintaining public dignity, and drew strength from that legacy of quiet courage. Her personal secretary, Margaret Whitfield, was waiting in the morning room with the day's schedule and a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea, prepared exactly as Anne preferred it. Margaret had worked with the princess for over 20 years and immediately sensed that something was amiss. Anne's usually sharp focus seemed scattered, and she was gripping the back of her chair with unusual intensity. The charity event was scheduled to begin at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with guests arriving at 1:30. The schedule was packed with meetings, briefings, and final preparations that would require Anne's full attention and energy. Under normal circumstances, Anne would have already begun reviewing her notes and making final adjustments to her speech. Instead, she found herself struggling to concentrate on even the simplest details. Margaret presented the guest list for the charity event, a carefully curated collection of major donors, celebrity supporters, and Save the Children beneficiaries. And had personally approved each invitation, knowing that her presence and attention to each guest would be crucial to the event's success. The responsibility weighed heavily on her, especially now when she wasn't sure she could deliver the level of engagement these important supporters deserved. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the palace physician, had been quietly summoned by Sarah Jenkins, who had grown increasingly concerned about the princess's condition during their walk in the gardens. Dr. Morrison had served the royal household for over a decade and was known for her discretion as much as her medical expertise. She arrived at the palace within 30 minutes of Sarah's call, prepared to conduct a subtle examination without drawing attention to any potential health concerns. And initially resisted Dr. Morrison's gentle suggestion for a brief health check, insisting that she felt perfectly fine and had important work to complete before the charity event. This resistance was entirely characteristic of Anne, who had always viewed any acknowledgement of physical weakness as a dereliction of duty. However, the doctor's persistence and Sarah's obvious concern eventually convinced Anne to submit to a quick examination in the privacy of her sitting room. The examination revealed what Dr. Morrison had suspected based on Sarah's description of Anne's symptoms. The princess's heart rate was irregular and elevated, her blood pressure was concerning, and she showed subtle signs of dehydration and exhaustion. While not immediately life-threatening, these symptoms indicated that Anne's body was under significant stress and needed immediate attention. Dr. Morrison recommended that Anne cancel her afternoon engagements and rest, a suggestion that was met with immediate and firm refusal. And explained that over 200 guests were expecting her presence, that significant donations had been pledged based on her personal involvement, and that disappointing these supporters was simply not an option. Her sense of duty, which had been both her greatest strength and her greatest burden throughout her life, would not allow her to consider backing down. A compromise was reached whereby Dr. Morrison would remain at the palace throughout the day, monitoring Anne's condition and standing ready to intervene if necessary. Additional precautions were put in place, including having medical staff discreetly positioned around the venue and ensuring that Anne's schedule included brief rest periods between her various obligations. As the morning progressed, Anne threw herself into the final preparations for the charity event with characteristic thoroughness. She reviewed every detail of the program, from the opening remarks to the final thank you speeches. She personally called several major donors to confirm their attendance and express her gratitude for their support. Each phone call required tremendous effort to maintain her usual warmth and energy, but Anne was determined not to let anyone detect that anything was wrong. The catering staff arrived to set up the elaborate lunch that would follow Anne's speech, transforming one of the palace's grand reception rooms into an elegant dining space. Anne insisted on personally inspecting the arrangements, making several small adjustments to ensure that everything met her exacting standards. Her attention to these details, which might have seemed excessive under normal circumstances, was actually helping her cope with the anxiety and physical discomfort she was experiencing. Meanwhile, the first guests were beginning to arrive, including several families who had been directly helped by Save the Children's programs. Anne had specifically requested that these families be given priority in the day's schedule, wanting to hear firsthand about the impact of the charity's work. Meeting with these families was always the highlight of such events for Anne, reminding her why her work mattered beyond the formal obligations and protocol. The Johnson family from Manchester had traveled down specifically to meet Princess Anne and share their story of how Save the Children had helped them through a difficult period. Their 8-year-old daughter, Emma, had been born with a serious heart condition, and the charity had provided both financial support and emotional guidance during her treatment. Emma was now healthy and thriving, and her parents wanted to thank the princess personally for her support of the organization. Anne's meeting with the Johnson family took place in her private study, away from the crowds and media attention. As she listened to their story and watched young Emma's bright smile, Anne felt a renewed sense of purpose that temporarily overshadowed her physical discomfort. These moments of genuine human connection were what made all the formal duties and endless obligations worthwhile. However, as the meeting concluded and prepared to join the larger gathering, she experienced another wave of the symptoms that had troubled her in the gardens. This time, the sensations were more intense and harder to ignore. Her vision became slightly blurred, and she had to steady herself against her desk to maintain her balance. Emma Johnson, with the innocent perception that children often possess, looked up at Princess Anne with concern and asked if she was feeling all right. The question, asked with such genuine care by someone so young, touched Anne deeply and reminded her that showing vulnerability wasn't always a sign of weakness. Sometimes, it was simply being human. And reassured Emma with a gentle smile, but the child's concern served as a wake-up call. If an 8-year-old could see that something was wrong, it would be impossible to hide her condition from the hundreds of guests and media representatives who would be watching her every move during the formal program. Dr. Morrison, who had been monitoring Anne from a discreet distance, approached during a quiet moment and once again urged the princess to consider modifying her schedule. The doctor's concern was evident, but she also understood Anne's dedication to her duties and the difficulty of asking her to disappoint so many people who had come specifically to see her. The compromise solution was to slightly modify Anne's role in the program, reducing the amount of time she would spend standing and ensuring that she would be seated during the most demanding portions of the event. These changes were subtle enough that guests wouldn't notice anything unusual, but significant enough to reduce the physical strain on Anne's already stressed system. As 1 o'clock approached, Anne made her way to the reception room where guests were gathering for pre-lunch drinks and conversation. The room was filled with the warmth and energy that characterized successful charity events, with supporters eager to discuss their philanthropic work and beneficiaries grateful for the opportunity to share their stories. And moved through the crowd with practiced grace, engaging each guest with apparent ease and genuine interest. Her years of experience had taught her how to make each person feel valued and heard, even during brief conversations. However, those closest to her could see the enormous effort required to maintain this level of engagement while managing her physical symptoms. The most challenging moment came when Anne was introduced to a group of young volunteers who had organized a sponsored walk to raise funds for Save the Children. Their enthusiasm and energy were infectious, and, under normal circumstances, Anne would have been delighted to hear about their efforts. Instead, she found herself struggling to maintain focus on their excited chatter while dealing with increasingly frequent waves of dizziness. As the time approached for the formal program to begin, Anne excused herself for a brief moment to gather her strength in private. Standing alone in a quiet corridor, she closed her eyes and took several deep breaths, trying to summon the reserves of strength that had carried her through decades of public service. She thought about all the children who would benefit from the day's fundraising efforts and reminded herself that her discomfort was temporary, but the impact of the event would be lasting. The sound of applause from the reception room indicated that guests were being called to take their seats for lunch and the formal program. Anne straightened her shoulders, checked her appearance in a nearby mirror, and prepared to fulfill her obligations regardless of how she felt. This moment of private determination would prove to be both admirable and potentially dangerous, as Anne pushed herself toward a confrontation with her own physical limits that would soon become impossible to avoid. The formal luncheon began precisely at 2 o'clock, with Anne taking her place at the head table alongside the chief executive of Save the Children and several major donors. The elegant dining room had been transformed into a perfect venue for the occasion, with fresh flowers from the palace gardens adorning each table and carefully selected artwork creating an atmosphere of refined philanthropy. Anne's speech was scheduled to be the centerpiece of the event, a 20-minute address that would highlight Save the Children's recent achievements and announce several new initiatives. She had spent weeks crafting the speech, incorporating personal anecdotes and specific examples that would resonate with the audience and inspire continued support. However, as she sat at the head table, the words on her carefully prepared notes seemed to blur together, making it difficult to focus on the content she knew by heart. The first course was served with military precision by the palace staff, who had coordinated countless such events over the years. And made polite conversation with her table companions, discussing everything from recent charity initiatives to shared acquaintances in the philanthropic community. To outside observers, she appeared to be her usual charming and engaged self, but those who knew her well could detect subtle signs of strain. Margaret Whitfield, seated at a nearby table, kept a careful watch on the princess throughout the meal. Margaret had learned to read Anne's body language over their many years of working together, and she could see the enormous effort Anne was exerting to maintain her usual level of social interaction. The slight tremor in Anne's hand as she reached for her water glass and the way she periodically pressed her fingers to her temple were warning signs that only someone very familiar with Anne would recognize. Dr. Morrison had positioned herself strategically near the back of the room, close enough to respond quickly if needed but far enough away to avoid drawing attention to her medical presence. She maintained regular eye contact with Anne throughout the meal, watching for any signs that immediate intervention might be necessary. The doctor had prepared a discreet medical kit and had already identified the quickest route to summon additional emergency medical support if required. As the meal progressed, Anne found herself struggling increasingly with the physical demands of the event. The combination of rich food, warm room temperature, and stress was exacerbating her symptoms significantly. Her heart rate continued to be irregular, and she was experiencing periodic waves of nausea that required tremendous self-control to manage without drawing attention. The conversation at the head table focused heavily on Save the Children's work in developing countries, a topic that normally energized Anne and brought out her most passionate advocacy. Today, however, she found it difficult to engage with her usual enthusiasm, instead offering shorter responses and relying more heavily on nods and smiles to indicate her agreement with others' comments. Young Emma Johnson, who had been seated at a family table near the front of the room, kept glancing toward Princess Anne with the concerned expression that had touched Anne so deeply during their private meeting. The child's intuitive awareness that something was wrong served as a constant reminder to Anne that her condition was becoming harder to hide, despite her best efforts to maintain her composure. The program moved forward with presentations from various Save the Children representatives, each highlighting different aspects of the organization's work. And was expected to respond to each presentation with appropriate comments and questions, a role that normally came naturally to her but was requiring enormous concentration under the current circumstances. As the time approached for her speech, Anne excused herself briefly, ostensibly to review her notes one final time. In reality, she needed a few moments away from the scrutiny of 200 pairs of eyes to gather her strength for what she knew would be the most challenging part of the day. In the quiet of a nearby anteroom, she splashed cool water on her wrists and took several deep breaths, trying to calm her racing heart and clear her increasingly foggy thinking. Sarah Jenkins found Anne in the anteroom and immediately offered to make an excuse to postpone the speech, suggesting that a technical issue with the sound system could provide cover for a brief delay. Anne firmly declined this offer, explaining that too many important people had come specifically to hear her speak, and that the children who would benefit from the day's fundraising efforts deserved her very best effort regardless of how she felt. When Anne returned to the dining room, she was greeted by warm applause from the assembled guests, who had been eagerly anticipating her remarks. She made her way to the podium with careful deliberation, using her years of training to project confidence and grace despite the internal turmoil she was experiencing. The familiar ritual of approaching the microphone and looking out at an expectant audience provided a momentary sense of normalcy that helped steady her nerves. Anne began her speech with the warmth and personal touch that had made her such an effective advocate for charitable causes. She spoke movingly about individual children whose lives had been transformed by Save the Children's programs, drawing on her extensive personal experience visiting projects around the world. Her voice was strong and clear, giving no indication of the physical struggle she was enduring. However, about 10 minutes into the speech, Anne began to notice that her symptoms were intensifying rather than subsiding. The stage lights seemed unusually bright, making it difficult to see the faces in the audience clearly. Her carefully memorized speech began to feel foreign and disconnected, as if someone else had written the words she was speaking. The audience, completely unaware of Anne's internal struggle, responded enthusiastically to her remarks, laughing at appropriate moments and applauding her more passionate statements about the importance of protecting vulnerable children around the world. Their positive energy provided Anne with additional motivation to continue, but it also increased the pressure she felt to maintain her performance level despite her deteriorating condition. Margaret Whitfield, watching from her table, could see subtle changes in Anne's delivery that indicated growing distress. Anne's usual fluid gestures had become slightly more rigid, and she was gripping the podium more tightly than normal. Most concerning was the fact that Anne was beginning to deviate slightly from her prepared text, a sure sign that her concentration was being affected by whatever physical symptoms she was experiencing. Dr. Morrison had moved closer to the front of the room and was now standing near a side door that would provide quick access to the podium if emergency intervention became necessary. She had also discreetly signaled to 2 palace security officers, who were now positioned where they could respond immediately if the princess required assistance. And pushed forward with her speech, drawing on reserves of determination that had sustained her through countless public appearances over nearly 5 decades of royal service. She spoke passionately about the responsibility that privileged individuals had to help those less fortunate, and about the particular obligation she felt as a member of the royal family to use her position to make a positive difference in the world. The emotional content of her speech was having an unexpected effect on Anne's physical condition. As she spoke about vulnerable children and the importance of compassion, she found herself becoming more deeply moved by her own words than usual. This emotional engagement was both helping her maintain connection with the audience and adding additional stress to her already overtaxed system. As Anne moved into the final portion of her speech, which focused on announcing new initiatives and thanking the assembled supporters, she felt a wave of dizziness that was stronger than anything she had experienced earlier in the day. The room seemed to sway slightly, and she had to pause briefly to regain her equilibrium. She covered this pause by taking a sip of water and making what appeared to be a thoughtful transition to her closing remarks. The audience interpreted Anne's pause as a moment of emotional reflection, responding with even more attentive silence and appreciation for the depth of feeling she was bringing to her remarks. This positive response gave an additional strength to continue, but it also meant that the expectations for a strong finish to her speech were now even higher. Anne's closing words focused on hope and determination, themes that resonated deeply with her own current situation even as she struggled to deliver them effectively. She spoke about the importance of perseverance in the face of challenges and about the extraordinary things that could be accomplished when people refused to give up on what mattered most to them. As she concluded her speech to enthusiastic applause, Anne felt a moment of triumph that temporarily overshadowed her physical discomfort. She had delivered an effective and moving address despite extraordinary personal challenges, maintaining her commitment to the children who would benefit from the day's fundraising efforts. However, this sense of accomplishment would prove to be short-lived, as the most dramatic and dangerous moments of the day were still ahead. Following the thunderous applause for her speech, Anne remained at the podium for several minutes, accepting congratulations from guests who approached to thank her personally for her moving words. Each handshake and brief conversation required enormous effort to maintain the warmth and engagement that people expected from her, but she was determined to give each supporter the personal attention they deserved. The post-speech reception period was traditionally one of Anne's favorite parts of such events, as it allowed for more intimate conversations about the charity's work and the personal motivations that drove people to support causes like Save the Children. However, today these interactions felt overwhelming rather than energizing, with each new conversation requiring her to summon energy reserves that were rapidly depleting. Emma Johnson approached the podium with her parents, clutching a handmade card she had created for Princess Anne during the meal. The 8-year-old had drawn a picture of herself and standing together in a garden, with the words "Thank you for helping children like me" written in careful block letters across the bottom. The simple gesture touched Anne profoundly, reminding her once again why her work mattered even when it came at personal cost. As Anne knelt down to accept Emma's gift and thank her properly, she experienced another intense wave of dizziness that made it difficult to maintain her balance. The child's concerned expression returned, and she instinctively reached out to steady Anne with her small hand. This moment of role reversal, with a young child offering support to the adult who was supposed to be the strong one, was both touching and alarming to those who witnessed it. Dr. Morrison, who had been watching this interaction carefully, decided that the time had come for more direct intervention. She approached him during a brief lull in the crowd around the podium and suggested, in a tone that was polite but firm, that it would be wise to move to a quieter location for the remainder of the event. And initially resisted this suggestion, pointing out that many guests were still waiting to speak with her. The compromise solution was to move the reception to the palace gardens, where Anne could continue meeting with supporters while having access to fresh air and a less crowded environment. This change was presented to the guests as an opportunity to enjoy the beautiful weather and see more of the palace grounds, rather than as a response to any health concerns. The transition to the gardens initially seemed to help Anne's condition. The fresh air and natural setting provided some relief from the symptoms that had been plaguing her throughout the day. She moved through the assembled guests with renewed energy, discussing their philanthropic work and sharing stories from her own experiences with Save the Children's projects around the world. However, this improvement proved to be temporary. As the afternoon progressed, Anne's symptoms returned with increasing intensity. The combination of stress, physical exertion, and the emotional demands of the event had pushed her body beyond its current limits. Her heart rate became increasingly irregular, and she began experiencing more frequent episodes of dizziness and disorientation. Sarah Jenkins had not left Anne's side since the move to the gardens, positioning herself where she could provide immediate assistance while remaining respectfully in the background. Sarah could see that Anne was struggling more than ever, but she also knew that any attempt to force the princess to stop would be met with firm resistance as long as guests remained who needed her attention. The final group of supporters consisted of a delegation from Scotland who had travelled specifically to meet Princess Anne and discuss expanding Save the Children's programs in rural Scottish communities. Their enthusiasm for the project and their detailed questions about implementation strategies normally would have energized Anne, but today she found it increasingly difficult to follow their complex proposals and respond with her usual insight and clarity. As Anne listened to the Scottish delegation's presentation, standing beneath the same oak tree where her symptoms had first manifested that morning, she felt as if her body was finally rebelling against her determination to continue. The world around her began to take on an increasingly dreamlike quality, with sounds becoming muffled and colors appearing strangely vivid. Margaret Whitfield, observing from nearby, could see that a crisis was rapidly approaching. Anne's face had become pale despite the warm afternoon sun, and she was gripping the back of a garden bench with obvious intensity. Margaret discreetly signaled to Dr. Morrison, who immediately began moving closer to the princess while trying not to alarm the guests who were still engaged in animated conversation about Scottish charity work. And made one final heroic effort to engage meaningfully with the Scottish delegation, asking thoughtful questions about their proposed timeline and offering insights based on her decades of charitable work. Her responses were coherent and helpful, but the enormous effort required to maintain this level of engagement while her body was in distress was unsustainable. The moment that everyone had been dreading finally arrived with shocking suddenness. As Anne turned to shake hands with the leader of the Scottish delegation, her legs simply gave way beneath her. There was no dramatic stumble or cry for help, just a sudden, complete collapse that sent her crumpling gracefully to the garden path like a flower finally succumbing to a harsh wind. The silence that followed was profound and terrifying. For a moment that seemed to last forever, everyone in the immediate vicinity stood frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Princess Anne, the woman who never showed weakness, never complained, and never failed to fulfill her duties, lay unconscious on the garden path surrounded by scattered papers from the Scottish delegation's proposal. Dr. Morrison was the first to respond, rushing to Anne's side and immediately beginning to assess her condition. The doctor's training took over, and she quickly established that Anne had a pulse and was breathing, though both were irregular and concerning. Sarah Jenkins knelt beside Anne, gently cradling her head while speaking softly to her, hoping that familiar voices might help bring her back to consciousness. The guests who had witnessed the collapse stood in shocked silence, uncertain whether they should try to help or step back to give the medical team space to work. The Scottish delegation, who had been mid-conversation when Anne collapsed, looked particularly stricken, wondering if their presentation had somehow contributed to the crisis. Margaret Whitfield immediately took charge of managing the situation, discreetly directing palace security to create a protective perimeter around Anne while Dr. Morrison worked. She also began the delicate process of managing the guests, providing enough information to explain what was happening without causing panic or compromising Anne's privacy. Emma Johnson, who had been playing nearby with other children when Anne collapsed, broke free from her parents and ran toward the unconscious princess. The sight of the small child kneeling beside Anne and gently patting her hand while saying "Wake up, Princess Anne, please wake up" brought tears to the eyes of many witnesses and emphasized the human impact of what was unfolding. Dr. Morrison quickly determined that Anne needed immediate medical attention beyond what could be provided in the garden setting. She called for an ambulance while simultaneously working to stabilize Anne's condition using the emergency medical supplies she had brought to the event. The irony that Anne had spent the day raising money to help vulnerable children, only to become vulnerable herself, was not lost on anyone present. As word of Anne's collapse began to spread throughout the palace and, to other guests who were still inside, a sense of gravity settled over what had been a joyous charitable celebration. The woman who had given so much of herself in service to others was now the one in need of care and support, a reversal that highlighted both her humanity and her extraordinary dedication to duty. The sound of approaching sirens created an surreal counterpoint to the peaceful garden setting where Anne lay surrounded by people who cared deeply about her welfare. The emergency responders would arrive within minutes, but those precious moments of uncertainty and fear had already changed everyone present, reminding them that even the strongest among us are ultimately fragile and human. Anne remained unconscious as the professional medical team took over her care, but her breathing had stabilized somewhat, and Dr. Morrison was cautiously optimistic that the crisis could be managed effectively with proper medical intervention. The real question now was what had caused the collapse and what it might mean for Anne's future ability to continue the demanding royal duties that had defined her life for nearly 7 decades. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes of Dr. Morrison's call, though it felt like an eternity to those gathered around Anne's motionless form. The paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, working alongside Dr. Morrison to stabilize the princess before attempting to transport her. Their professional calm provided some reassurance to the worried onlookers, though the gravity of the situation remained frighteningly apparent. Anne regained consciousness just as the medical team was preparing to move her to the ambulance. Her first words, whispered but distinctly audible to those closest to her, were an apology to the Scottish delegation for not being able to finish their conversation about the charity programs. Even in her moment of greatest vulnerability, her first concern was for others and for the duties she felt she had failed to complete. The decision was made to transport Anne to the private wing of St. Mary's Hospital, where the royal family typically received medical care during emergencies. The journey was brief but tense, with Dr. Morrison accompanying Anne while Sarah Jenkins and Margaret Whitfield followed in a separate vehicle. The hospital had been alerted to prepare for a royal patient requiring immediate cardiac evaluation and treatment. Back at the palace, the remaining guests were gently but efficiently managed by senior palace staff who had decades of experience handling unexpected crises with grace and discretion. The official explanation provided was that Princess Anne had experienced a brief medical episode due to exhaustion and would be receiving appropriate medical care. Most guests understood the implicit request for privacy and discretion regarding what they had witnessed. Emma Johnson, who had been deeply affected by seeing Princess Anne collapse, asked her parents if they could send flowers to the hospital. Her innocent desire to help the princess who had been so kind to her earlier in the day touched everyone who heard it, and word spread quietly among the guests that flowers and well wishes would indeed be welcome. The spontaneous outpouring of concern from people who had witnessed Anne's collapse became a testament to the deep affection and respect she had earned through decades of selfless service. At St. Mary's Hospital, a team of cardiac specialists began comprehensive testing to determine the exact cause of Anne's collapse. Initial examinations revealed that she had experienced a cardiac arrhythmia, likely triggered by a combination of stress, exhaustion, and dehydration. The condition was serious but treatable, though it would require significant changes to Anne's typically demanding schedule to prevent future episodes. Dr. James Richardson, the senior cardiologist treating Anne, was struck by her immediate concern for the charity event and her repeated requests to return to complete her obligations to the guests. Even as she underwent extensive cardiac monitoring and testing, and insisted on dictating thank you messages to be sent to every person who had attended the Save the Children fundraiser, ensuring that their support was properly acknowledged despite the dramatic end to the event. The palace communications team faced the delicate challenge of crafting a statement that would inform the public about Anne's condition without causing undue alarm or compromising her privacy. The statement, released 6 hours after the collapse, confirmed that Princess Anne had experienced a medical episode during a charity event and was receiving excellent care at hospital. It emphasized that her condition was stable and that she was expected to make a full recovery. The media response was immediate and intense, with news outlets around the world picking up the story of Princess Anne's collapse. However, the coverage was notably respectful and supportive, reflecting the genuine affection that both the British public and international observers had developed for Anne over her decades of dedicated service. Many reports emphasized her legendary work ethic and suggested that her collapse was the inevitable result of putting duty before personal care for too many years. King Charles III arrived at the hospital within hours of Anne's admission, visibly concerned about his sister's condition but also expressing pride in her dedication to charitable work even in the face of personal health challenges. Other family members followed throughout the evening, creating an unprecedented gathering of senior royals at St. Mary's Hospital that emphasized both the seriousness of the situation and the close family bonds that existed despite their public roles. Anne spent 3 days in the hospital undergoing comprehensive cardiac evaluation and treatment. During this time, she received thousands of messages from well-wishers around the world, ranging from heads of state to ordinary citizens who had been touched by her decades of public service. The volume of positive responses surprised even Anne, who had never fully understood the depth of public affection and respect she had earned. Young Emma Johnson's handmade card, which had been recovered from the garden where Anne collapsed, was among the first items brought to her hospital room. Anne kept the child's drawing on her bedside table throughout her stay, later describing it as a reminder that even in moments of weakness, the connections we make with others can provide extraordinary strength and comfort. The medical team's final diagnosis confirmed that Anne's collapse had been caused by cardiac arrhythmia triggered by chronic stress and exhaustion. Dr. Richardson was firm in his recommendation that Anne needed to significantly reduce her royal engagements and implement proper rest periods to prevent future episodes. This medical necessity would force a conversation about royal duties and personal limits that Anne had been avoiding for years. The palace's official statement about Anne's diagnosis and treatment plan was carefully crafted to acknowledge the seriousness of her condition while emphasizing her expected full recovery. The statement also included Anne's personal message of gratitude to everyone who had expressed concern and support, and her commitment to returning to her charitable work as soon as medically appropriate. Anne's recovery period at home provided an unexpected opportunity for reflection and family connection that her demanding schedule had not allowed for years. Visits from grandchildren, quiet conversations with family members, and the simple pleasure of spending unscheduled time in her beloved gardens helped her understand what she had been sacrificing in her relentless pursuit of duty. The Save the Children fundraising event, despite its dramatic conclusion, ultimately raised more money than originally projected. The story of Anne's collapse while working to help vulnerable children resonated powerfully with donors, who responded with increased generosity as a way of honoring her dedication. The Scottish delegation's proposals for expanded rural programs were not only approved but received additional funding specifically designated as a tribute to Anne's service. When Anne finally returned to public duties 6 weeks later, her approach had changed significantly. While still deeply committed to her charitable work, she implemented the medical team's recommendations for a more sustainable schedule that included regular rest periods and health monitoring. Her first public appearance was at a small Save the Children event, where she was greeted with unprecedented warmth and appreciation from supporters who understood the personal cost of her service. Emma Johnson was among the special guests at Anne's return event, presenting the princess with a new handmade card that read, "Thank you for taking care of yourself so you can keep helping others." The wisdom contained in those simple words from an 8-year-old perfectly captured the lesson that Anne had learned through her collapse and recovery. The garden oak tree where Anne had experienced her first symptoms, and where she had ultimately collapsed, became an informal memorial to the importance of recognizing human limits even in the pursuit of noble goals. Palace staff reported that Anne often paused there during her morning walks, not with sadness about what had happened, but with gratitude for the opportunity to continue her work in a more sustainable way. Anne's collapse and recovery became a turning point not just in her own life, but in broader conversations about the pressures faced by public figures and the importance of maintaining personal health while serving others. Her willingness to acknowledge her vulnerability and make necessary changes inspired countless people who were struggling with similar challenges in their own lives, proving that sometimes our greatest service to others comes through taking proper care of ourselves. The emotional dawn statement released by the palace the morning after Anne's collapse had been brief but powerful, acknowledging the human cost of dedicated service while expressing confidence in her recovery and continued contributions. That statement, read around the world, became a reminder that even those who seem strongest among us need support, understanding, and, occasionally, the wisdom to know when to rest so they can continue to serve another day.